How do you make a perfect pop song? That's a question I've been obsessed with since the 80s when I joined my first band. I've spoken to Grammy-winning record producers, famous musicians, engineers, label owners. I've been in studios and watched as hit records were being made. I've even pulled apart original multi-tracks of synth pop number ones from the 80s to find out what makes a hit a hit. And here's what I've discovered. Everybody has their own opinion of what makes a hit, but there's one thing they all agree on. Your song isn't even going to be a contender if it doesn't cast a spell over the listener. How do you do that? Well, back in the 80s, the best record producers had a set of rules and techniques and some tricks that they used to ensure that their track had a certain magic quality that meant it could go all the way. But these golden rules have largely been forgotten today. Why? Because nowadays we tend to make music on computers instead of in studios where we used our ears in a very different way. So now I'm going to share everything that I've discovered in this special video series all about long-lost production secrets of the 1980s. So here's a quiz. What are the key ingredients of a hit record? Well, apart from the lead vocal, there are three: the kick, the snare, and the bass. You get those right, the foundations of your song are going to be okay, and you can put all the fancy stuff on top, and your song won't fall over. But that's not me talking. That's more or less a verbatim quote from one of my favourite 80s producers, Martin Rushent. He worked with everyone from punks like Buzzcocks and the Stranglers to making one of the best synth-pop records of all time, Dare by the Human League. And I think about his quote a lot. What does it mean to get the kick and the snare and the bass working together? Well, let's start with the bass, and I've distilled that down into three core principles, and this video is about the first of those. These are some of my old band's original multi-track tapes.
Actually looks like this was 31st of July 1990, so just outside the 80s.
We were using technology like this: 8 and 16 track reel-to-reel tape recorders.
Stereo overhead, stereo toms, kick, snare, hat, bass, and so on and so forth.
But the final track on every tape was given over to something called timecode. This enabled our basic sequencing software like Cubase to sync up to our tape machine. And these new sequences were at the core of everything we were doing. The reason why we were using technology like this is because as a band we were transitioning away from trying to sound like the Police to trying to sound like New Order and Pet Shop Boys and other electronic artists that we were listening to and had fallen in love with. And I remember when I heard West End Girls just being blown away by how simple it was in terms of parts, and yet the emotional impact it had. So we understood how those records were made, or we thought we did, and so we did what we thought they were doing, which was we got tape machines and we synchronized up sequences to them to handle all the electronic parts. And let's hear how well we did. So there's quite a few parts there, and it certainly doesn't sound like it's only an 8-track recording, but it was, because in fact only the vocal and the guitars are coming off tape, and the final track in the 8-track was used with a synchronizing timecode, and it was synchronized up to a sequencer from Memory Performer, and that was playing all of the electronic parts, the electronic drums, the electronic percussion, the synth bass, the lead lines, the pad lines, everything. And it makes for quite a serviceable track. It lacks emotion, and it definitely doesn't cast a spell. And although we tried to do this kind of thing again and again and again, we could never really figure out what we were doing wrong or what we were doing that was so fundamentally different to the people we were listening to. These were synth pop artists who were under absolutely no illusion. They programmed everything up, synchronized it to a tape, and then really just used the tape for stuff that had to be real. Or so we thought. Well, no, that's not right at all. In fact, the bass on West End Girls is played. Not only that, but the bass on Sweet Dreams by Eurythmics is played, and all the early Depeche Mode bass is played, and so the list goes on. This blew my mind when I found out about it years later, and I couldn't understand why. Why, on a synth pop track with strict tempo, when you could program the bass and you needed it to be in time anyway, why would you not do that? Why would you go through the hassle of playing it? Especially since, by all accounts, the actual synth bass on West End Girls was a bit of a nightmare to do. Apparently they had to do drop in after drop in, take after take, to get it in time with the track. Not surprising, I think. Why don't you just program it in and sync it up? Well, there are some really, really good reasons why, for synth bass, if you can, it turns out playing it rather than programming it can really elevate it to the next level. Of the two reasons that I'm going to give you, the first one, we have to go all the way back to a famous band from the 70s called Chic, with a bass player called Bernard Edwards. He's probably the most sampled bass player in recording history, having played bass on a track called Good Times, which has been sampled again and again and again. It was the basis for Rapper's Delight by Sugar Hill Gang, countless other samples, and that's not even including Queen's mega hit Another One Bites the Dust, which, although it didn't sample his bass line, borrows very, very heavily from it. Edwards was a master at reacting in real time to music and fitting his notes against the rhythm, letting some of them ring out, while others he might play staccato or muted. And the end result is that elusive thing called feel. And it's the difference between a vanilla track and a hit. So the fundamental point of this video is to make the case that when it comes to synth bass, try to perform, if you can, rather than program. And performing does not mean that you can't quantize your performance. If you need your synth bass notes to be hitting exactly on some kind of grid or against some transient, move them if you have to. But try not to screw around too much with note length, because that's where a lot of the magic lies. So if the first part of why perform, don't program is note length control, what's the second? Well, the second is something I call timbre control. Even monosynths, crude monosynths from the 1970s, that couldn't respond to velocity, you could still change the way that a note sounded while you were playing it by riding the filter. But by the 80s, you had a lot of velocity sensitive bass synths, and at the very least, when you hit the note hard or soft, it would change volume. But you can go a lot further than that. I think the best example of a bass synth which has an extraordinary amount of timbre control is my favorite bass synth patch from that period, from 1987, which is made on a Yamaha TX81Z, mine is down in that rack, and a very famous patch called Lately Bass. And it sounds like this. Or does it? Because it can also sound like this. Notice that when I went, involuntarily, I hit that note harder. And that's what this patch is so good at. Now, ironically, even though it's a very famous bass patch, I hear it all the time on records from that period where it's obviously programmed, because it goes, as opposed to what it should do is. amount of timbre control you can get into bass patches like that, again, can transform a relatively ordinary part into something that's completely legendary and full of emotion and tension. You can now respond in real time, just like Bernard Edwards did in Chic, to the music that you're hearing. As it builds, your bass playing can build, even if it's the same part, because you're playing it differently. Slightly different note lengths, slightly different timbre. So that's the second reason why it's a great idea to, if you can, perform synth bass rather than just straightforward programming it. Those two reasons are control of note length and control of timbre. And if you get this kind of stuff right, you elevate an ordinary bass part into a legendary bass part and potentially take quite a vanilla track into something that could really be a hit and emotionally connect with the audience and cast a spell. Pet Shop Boys understood this when they have hand-played so many of their bass parts, as have countless others. But look, talking about music is a bit like dancing about architecture, so to really bring this point home, I'm going to demonstrate what difference playing a synth bass can make as opposed to programming a synth bass. And to do that, I'm just going to throw some chords and a beat together quickly in a speed run. And any resemblance to West End Girls is, of course, entirely accidental. Well, I'm turning the speed run timer on now. And the first thing I'm going to do is change the tempo to 114 BPM. And let's just throw some chords together in 10 or 15 minutes. That won't be a cover of West End Girls, but will certainly sound a little bit like it. So there's a 4-on-the-floor kick drum that I'm putting on track 1 of the sequencer, just coming straight out my Roland drum machine. And now let's do a shaker part that's quite authentic. So I'm going to use my EMU Proteus for this. It's got a few different shakers, and I'm going to combine them to make a plausible shaker part. That's how I play it. And let me just program them in. So the first sample is on the 1, 2, 3, 4. The next one is a 16th after it. And the third one is a 16th after that. That sounds pretty good. So let's now put a snare on track 2, which is where I normally put it. Let's also get it from the Roland. Okay. I'll just scroll through and find the snare I like. One of the snares I like. There we are. Just on the 2 and 4. It's already sounding pretty good. Now I'm going to use my 909 to make a rim shot part, and I'm also going to use this for a gate for one of my pads. So there's my rim, and I'm going to do it in a classic 80s programming way, which is it'll be a 2-bar phrase. I need to turn up the rim shot on the 909. Hang on. There we are. And the second bar will be like the first bar, but with a bit of extra variation. Normally, some hits added. This is a classic way of doing an 80s percussion key. Pet Shop Boys typically used congas, cowbells, and maybe some tuned metal hits or go-go's. Stock Aitken and Waterman used a lot of this sort of 909 rim shot key, as did Trevor Horn, who for Frank, he did it with cowbells and claps. Just fiddling about here, just getting it to sound good. Once you've established this rhythm key, you find that your playing, assuming you are playing, fits in with it. So often it's not so easy to change the key later because you change the feel of the entire song. But that's feeling pretty good to me. Yeah. That it's very characteristic of 80s pop. It's very good. There's no swing on this, but it really starts to groove because all the different elements sort of smash together and sort of counter pump against each other. So you get this sense of dynamics. Well, let's keep going, and I'm just going to put some hi-hats in. I won't use them throughout the entire track, but just for a little bit of a lift, and classic disco hats. So closed on the 1, 2, 3, 4, and then open on the off 8s. They need to be turned up a little bit. So the mixing I do doorlessly is very much using the actual volume controls on the instruments or trimming the inputs on my interface. So let's just listen to this groove, just check it's okay before we move on. I think it is. Okay, so now let's do the pads, and we're just going to do the pads against this backbeat. Now I've got my MIDI rigged up so that when I play a single chord on the keyboard, I'm actually triggering about 4 voices from 2 synths. And in a real production, I'd never do this. I'd always, when it came to multiple pad voices, play each one separately. And the main reason is that each voice has a slightly different VCA and VCF envelope. But for the purposes of this, for speed if nothing else, it's perfectly fine just to play them all in at the same time. It sounds really nice, very full. Okay, there's the part. And now, it wouldn't be a Distort the Preamp video without those gates. So I'm actually only gating one of the synths. And that's obviously being gated straight off the rhythm key that we established earlier with the 909 rim shot. So you see what I mean, that rim pattern sort of fits into the whole track. And even though we've got hardly any parts and no bass, it's already got a really nice feel. Really nice feel. Just a couple of chords at this stage. Right, so now I'm going to put a snare fill in the usual way that I've talked about before on this channel, which is I'm going to use track 3 on my sequencer, set it to an 8-bar pattern, and then only in the final bar I'll put my snare fill in. This gives me a lot of control. Certainly at this stage, which is sort of a writing stage, if it came down to a final production, after I've tracked it into the DAW, sometimes I do some additional mutes. I think we have a problem with our pad chords, which is it sounds like that the first chord was early and therefore is only being triggered on the cycle. It's not being triggered in the initial entrance. So I'm just going to see if I can fix it with the quantize. And that isn't fixing it. This actually happens because I've got a soft metronome and I haven't set my metronome up properly, which is why I was slightly early. So I need to get the chord right. There you go. Okay, so there's clearly something wrong with my brain at this point. Let's try again. Let's see if that's fixed it. Yeah, it has. So what I did there is I deliberately played it slightly late and then I let the quantize bring it back. Whereas with it being early, the quantize couldn't bring it forward. And now just adding in the bass notes. And no, I didn't get that bass note right. The bass note was early as well. Just do it again. There we go. Sure, that's right. No? Okay. It's not my day, is it? Going to spend half the time fixing the pads. All right, so I'll do it again and I'll deliberately play the fast note almost sarcastically late. It's like 16th late. Yeah, there you go. And then the quantize will bring it in. Oh, the joys of working duellessly. All right, so let's just do pads in some of the other sections because I'll just change some things together. Maybe I'll use a pad sound instead of weird timbali hit. Okay. So the same chords, but just a slightly different treatment. Felt nice. Check the timing. Yeah, that's okay. Not sure if I want to put the bass notes under the chords. I might do later. But now let's put some proper Pet Shop Boys chords in. There we go. Doesn't get much more Pet Shop Boys than that, or those diatonic seventh chords. For more details on this production technique, please see my 335-part video series, How to Sound Like the Pet Shop Boys from the 80s. I hope to get it finished before 2035, so please watch this space. Check timing. Yeah. Quantizing pads is fine. I really want to stress that in a real production, I wouldn't necessarily take all of these shortcuts. But in terms of knocking up a backing track in 10 or 15 minutes, I think it's legit. Right, let's just look at some transitional bits. Apparently I'm on the Proteus Fantasia patch accidentally, which is obviously a rip-off of the D50 Fantasia patch. It's not bad. Okay, now we've got a MIDI out, there we are. So I've just changed over to my Magic Pad patch. It's all sounding great. And that relentless backing, and of course the critical kick and snare. And that nice fill there. It's all good. What are you running at? About 9:55 so far. Just past the 10-minute mark. So there's lots of ways of building sketches like this quickly, but one surefire method is to get a really good groove going, multiple parts that you can mute and unmute, stick some chords over the top. There we go. It's all very satisfactory. So that's the programming done at just under 10.5 minutes. And now I can show you the profound difference between bass that's programmed into a sequencer and bass that's performed. So the bass sound that I'm using to demonstrate this sounds like this. Which is a pretty great bass sound. So I'm not playing exactly the West End Girls part for obvious YouTube reasons, but it's highly derivative. So now I'm going to program rather than play a part. And the method I've always used for this is you start by getting the rhythm right, and then you change the notes. Otherwise, you just go crazy. So hopefully I'm getting the rhythm almost right. Not quite, nearly. There we go, that's the right rhythm but not the right notes. This is a trick I used to use a lot in the 80s when I was programming a lot of stuff into sequences. But of course now I play it. I learnt my lesson. I'm just fixing the notes. And I should say that this kind of sound is definitely a mood. This sort of robotic, every note is the same velocity, every note is the same length, is definitely a sound. But it's not emotional enough, and it's not as good, anywhere near as good as what we'll end up with. I'm going to fix the note lengths in a couple of them just because that's what I would have done. In many ways, it actually makes it slightly worse. I almost kind of like the utterly robotic feel. And there were some amazing synth pop albums that almost made a virtue out of this. So Technique by New Order, for example, all of those bass parts are obviously programmed. But think of it as an instrument, and imagine that instrument was being played by a human being. Then obviously that human being would be responding in real time as the intensity and dynamics of the music change. And you don't get any of that, and therefore there is a limit to the amount of emotion that you can convey with these robotic bass parts. And you can hear that it sounds a little clumsy, a little leaden, And now I'll play it. My timing is going to be a little off because I'm also muting and unmuting, but there's a bounce to it. And the reason why I'm muting and unmuting tracks is because I want to demonstrate to you that as the intensity of the track changes, my playing responds. So nice and sort of pulled back there. Using the dynamics to really emphasize the soft bass. Apologies for not particularly keeping that in time. But you will have heard my playing changing as the music changed. It's like being in a real band, and this is how you do it. So you don't play like that because it won't be good enough usually, and sometimes it just won't cut it. You know, getting that bounce on the da-da-da-da is something really easy to play, very difficult to program, because what you're doing when you're playing is riding the tension. But look, what if you are not a very good keyboard player? Well, let me show you a technique. Let's listen. Okay, it's very robotic. And now let's say we want to get more emotion into it. You can do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play, but I'm just going to play on a single note. Hit record on. Now, even that single note sounds so much better than the robotic program part. It just fits a lot better. You can quantize it if you couldn't get it on the grid, but the bounce comes from the note length and the timbre and it being played by a human. And now you can go in and fix the pitches, just like we did before. So there are many, many ways in which even if you can't really play the keyboards, you can inject humanity into your playing and have it work a lot better against the bass and the snare. So even though all I was really capturing in that take was velocity and note length, because I quantized the note starts, you can still see when you look at them that I've got velocity of 120, 112, 97, dun-dun. So you can hear I'm sort of tapping out the bounce, which is what it's all about. The note length will be also very special, but difficult to read on my sequencer without exporting the MIDI and examining it. But you also find that if you think about it in terms of a take, you can go round and round and play it again and again. And that's not really going to take you very much time in the context of how long it takes to get really good program stuff anyway. And this just sounds better. Just sounds better. It's amazing how good that sounds, actually. Just added the extra note. It just sounds so special, doesn't it? But I really don't want anyone watching to feel that they have to be able to, you know, do flourishes like... Speaking of round and round. Because if you can't do that, that's totally fine. You can still get the humanity and emotion by using yourself to actually input a part and build tension and build intensity, even if you're only capturing velocity information, which is going to translate into timbre and note length. Look, I spent a long time in the 80s programming parts into sequences. And whilst I got the part that was in my head, it never quite sounded right. And it wasn't until years later when I realized that what my heroes were doing was largely playing the parts. And then that's what I did, that I realized how transformative that is. All of a sudden, it's very easy to get the bounce, get the tension built, get the emotional change. And, of course, you end up with a part that's so good that it can be foundational if you mute everything else apart from the kick and the snare. Sometimes if you mute everything else just apart from the kick. And that was nothing I'd really experienced before. And it comes back to what Martin Rushent said, which is if you get the bass and the snare and the kick working together, you've got great foundations for your song. Put as much fancy stuff as you like on top of it, and the song won't fall over. And so thinking of the bass part as being a foundational part, I believe, requires something more special than simply programming it in, whether you're clicking a mouse and programming it on the DAW, or whether you're laboriously pressing buttons on a sequencer. That can be done, but I don't think it's good enough. And certainly if you want to make what I would describe as emotional synth pop, playing is a much better way to go. So now, having chained all those sequences together that I did earlier in the little speed run, I'll do a live bass take, warts and all. There won't be any editing for this track, which definitely is not West End Girls. If you want to hear more stories about 80s production techniques and watch them being applied in real time to actual music, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
I have no idea what's on track 11. It says Cookie Monster. Oh my God.